Well, good afternoon, folks. Welcome to INC-5 UK National Treaty Dialogues on Plastic Pollution, the plenary session. For many of you, you've joined us over the last couple of weeks as we've had the sectoral meetings, but this is where we bring you all together. It's your last chance to have that conversation this afternoon regarding the trends and ideas and challenges that we need to hear ahead of that meeting in Korea in November later on this year. Bit of housekeeping before we get started. This session is being recorded. If I could ask all of you, please, I know you've been through this process before, but if you go to the top right-hand side of your screen, there should be 3 little dots when you hover over it with your cursor. Drop down there, rename, if you could rename yourself with your full name and the organization you represent. That just helps us to know who we all are, but also when my colleagues assign you to breakout rooms later on this afternoon, it means I don't have to search on LinkedIn or Google you in order to make sure you're in the right room. So just rename yourself, please. Sit back, relax. Please turn your camera on, sit comfortably. This is participatory this afternoon. We need to hear from you. So whilst I'd ask you just to mute for the moment, please let's have your camera on. I know the temptation is always to drift into your inbox on these things, but we'd love to get as much as we can from you this afternoon. So this is, as I mentioned, the plenary session of this process we've been running over the last few weeks, and I'm delighted to introduce the Minister for Water and Flooding, Emma Hardy, who is actually going to start us off this afternoon before we get underway. So Ms. Hardy, if you're there, please, if you wouldn't mind just coming on camera. I think we're going to pin you anyway, and we'd love to welcome you to the conversation this afternoon and get your opening remarks.
Thank you so much. And thank you for joining me today for the 5th UK Plastic Pollution Treaty Dialogue. For those who don't know me, I'm Minister Hardy. I am the Minister for Water and Flooding, and within my remit, I'm responsible for international marine policy and for the negotiations on the Plastics Treaty. As a new government, we have made clear our commitment to tackling climate change and reducing waste by creating a circular economy, as well as speeding up nature's recovery. We're committed to working with civil society, communities and businesses to restore and protect our natural world on land and, of course, in our ocean. So it is encouraging to see businesses, NGOs and academia coming together to discuss how we can successfully conclude an ambitious treaty to end plastic pollution. I know that many of you have been participating in these dialogues since 2022, and thank you. Your input is invaluable in shaping the UK approach to these important negotiations and ensuring that we understand a range of views and priorities across the plastics value chain. Plastics are, of course, incredibly useful in a number of areas and are very durable materials. However, these very properties are, of course, behind the increasing problem of plastic pollution. As we know, science predicts that there will be a 3-fold increase in the amount of plastic entering the ocean between 2016 and 2040. And this is a complex global problem, which is why we urgently need to coordinate a global response. This government is committed to creating a roadmap to a circular economy, a future where we keep our resource in use for longer and waste is reduced, where we see investment in critical infrastructure and green jobs, and where our economy prospers and nature thrives. But we can't do this alone. This is why we need a global response to create a systems change that will move us towards that circular economy, providing opportunities for society and the economy and a level playing field. That is why these treaty negotiations are so vital. We are really proud to be an active member of the high ambition coalition of countries committed to securing an ambitious legally binding instrument to end plastic pollution by 2040. Wouldn't that be great? I know many businesses and organisations are leading the way already. An example of this is the Business Coalition for a Global Plastics Treaty, joined by over 85 organisations, including major global businesses, financial institutions and NGOs, many of which I know are on this call right now. The UK scientific community is also looking at solutions and innovations that will help us take action on this issue. But a successful treaty will hinge on the people from across the plastic system who can actually make change happen. This is why continued dialogue with you on how the treaty can support that change is so important. As we approach our NIC-5 in November, we are at a critical point of the negotiations. We have come a long way, but there is still much work to be done to secure an agreement. However, the UK government remains committed and determined to see this through by working together and finding solutions. I look forward to our continued collaboration to make this happen. And I thank you again for coming here today to share your ideas and inspire the government to negotiate an effective treaty. Thanks, everyone.
Mr. Hardy, thank you very much for those opening comments and appreciate you and your constituency today. And it's been a fairly busy day already, so feel free to hang around if you like, but I appreciate that you might have other things to get to. But thank you for opening us up. So let's get started, folks. How do we get here? Okay, as the Minister mentioned, as we mentioned at the beginning, we're looking towards INC-5 in November in Korea. As many of you have been part of these dialogues through the last 18 to 24 months, we've been working through those different stages and the additional intersessional meetings that took place a few weeks ago in Thailand have all informed where we are now. But now we're aiming towards that endpoint in November 2024, INC-5 in Korea. And over the course of this process, we've had a couple of touch points with you. We've had a couple of opportunities. If we could just, there we go, thank you. So we started this process at the beginning of the month, 4 sectoral meetings, the opportunity for each of you in your relevant stages of the value chain to come together to discuss some of the topics we're going to look at this afternoon. But this, as we promised when we were going through those, is the moment where we bring all of you together. Gives you the opportunity to see the comments that were made in the other conversations, to revisit the ones that you and your peers made during the course of those sectoral meetings, and having that final chance to just interrogate those boards, interrogate those conversations, put your comments in so we can capture all that information to send forward to that final report. But we did also send you a survey. We sent you a survey after the sectoral meetings finished, and that is the next stage in these conversations to make sure we get all of that information captured and put forward to that final report for UK government ahead of the meeting in Korea in November. This is a big ask, folks, because the survey is going to be closing in the next 48 hours. We need you, if you haven't already filled it out, to do so. And by that, I mean a full contribution. We need to capture as much of that information through that process so we can analyze it as effectively as possible. Marta has just put the link into the chat. So if you haven't had a chance to get onto it yet, open it out, put it in a window, leave it for when we finish here. If you don't have a perspective on one of the answers, they're open box answers. That's what we've been asked to provide this time. Just say no comment at this stage. We need to get as much information from you as possible. So we're going to give you an extra 48 hours just to work through that form and capture that in over the next couple of days. And that will then be brought all together to generate that final report, which will inform the negotiators ahead of that meeting, INC-5, on the 25th of November. And of course, you've all been here through the course of these conversations. We have brought together academia, we've brought together civil society, we've been looking at waste management, recyclers. We wanted to generate a representation across the whole of the value chain. And of course, we've done that in its individual elements up until this point. But today it's about bringing you all together, bringing all sides of the plastic crisis to the table to get those last 3 comments, the last 3 trends before we generate that report. In terms of the agenda today, it'll feel slightly different to the previous sessions if you've attended. We've obviously heard the opening remarks from Minister Hardy. We're going to move into very shortly a panel discussion where we're going to hear from 4 industry voices, which have been selected from the sectoral dialogues over the course of this month. Once we've had a chance to have that conversation, we're then going to review broadly with Marta, the CEO of OPLN, who's going to review the sectoral meetings for you to pull out the key points before we go into the main event. And that is the breakout sessions. We're going to break you into 2 groups today. You'll be automatically assigned, there'll be a little bit more detail on that in a moment, but you'll be automatically assigned into either breakout room A or B. In room A, you'll be with myself and my colleague Megan, and we'll be looking at cross-cutting issues, primary plastic production and chemicals and problematic plastics. And room B with Marta and our colleague Rachel, who will be looking at product design, primary plastic production and means of implementation. But a little more information on that shortly. Once we've been through that process for about 30 minutes, We'll then come back towards the end for a group playback. We'll pick out the key elements of those conversations. We'll also nominate some of you to have a few moments to share your thoughts off the course of those conversations. And then we'll hand over to the Deputy Director of International Marine for DEFRA, Mr. James Smith, who will close the session out and finish this afternoon. A lot to get through, no apologies made there. We've got a lot of ground to cover, but let us kick on and let us start with the panel discussion. So it gives me a great honour to introduce some of the voices that you will have heard over the course of the sectoral meetings. We've got Jeff Mackey, who's the UK Country Director from Plastics Europe, Ed Shepherd, who's the Senior Global Sustainability Manager and Circular Economy at Unilever, Chilla Magia, who's the Global Director of Plastics and Chemicals Policy, Dow Chemicals, and Christina Dixon, Ocean Campaign Leader for the Environmental Investigation Agency. Good afternoon, folks. If I'd ask you just to turn your cameras on, please, so the people at home can see you. I think I need to be unpinned. There we go. Just see my big face. There's Ed. Great. Jeff. There's two. There's Chilla. And last but not least, Christina. Hello, folks. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. We've got about 20-25 minutes. I've got some questions that I'm going to throw at you, but the ambition is to get as much of your thoughts across so we can predicate those conversations for the breakout rooms this afternoon. So let's start with an easy one. What is the greatest risk to INC-5 and the consensus of agreement around the treaty? What is the biggest risk? We're getting towards the end of the process now. We've been through a lot of topics, but what do you think the biggest risk is and the consensus of agreement around the treaty? And Ed, if you don't mind, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you all. So, as a business, we're facing a highly fragmented policy landscape on plastic, where we have different regulations in different countries. And this adds complexity and costs to our operations, and it really impacts our ability to serve consumers with the goods and products that they want. So at INC-5, there remains a significant risk that a treaty could be agreed based solely on national action plans. And, we're clear that a treaty based on voluntary measures alone really risks decades of slow and fragmented policy development, which would kind of only further fragment the issues that we're currently facing as a business and bring more cost and complexity. So, really the biggest risk is this missed opportunity to actually deliver an instrument that is going to set us on a pathway to solve this problem. And political will is absolutely key now. And that's why Unilever and the Business Coalition for a Global Plastics Treaty, we're calling on governments to unite and deliver a treaty that is fit for purpose. And for us, we see a treaty that is fit for purpose as one with binding global rules that harmonizes the policy landscape that we're dealing with as a business, that strengthens national legislation, and really helps business to scale the proven solutions that we already have for priority sectors such as packaging.
Thank you, Ed, for kicking us off. Chilla, if you don't mind, I might come to you next.
Yes, thank you, and hello, everybody. So I'd also like to really focus on the opportunity side, right? For us, we really feel it's now time for the governments to agree on key areas of convergence, conclude the negotiations now at INC-5 in November, and conclude a treaty that is inclusive of all countries. We want nobody left behind. There's a great opportunity for our business that this agreement will drive plastic circularity and end plastic pollution. So we really hope, just like Ed said, that there is enough political will to come to the table now and then maybe leave some details where there is some divergence to the COP process later on.
Thanks, Chilla. I guess, Christina, you were nodding away a little bit there. I'd love to get your perspective on this. We've heard there about kind of cost. We've heard about consumers. Ed picked out that idea around kind of the voluntary element and how that might slow things down. And Chilla very much talking there about the sort of opportunity and making sure that we create a treaty that works for everyone rather than the few. But but how do you see the risks? How do you see the opportunities here?
Thanks, James. Yeah, I think from my perspective, the biggest risk that we face now is that the pressure of a deadline. So I don't know how it was like for you at school, but when you're cramming last minute to get something in on time. We have this looming deadline of trying to conclude negotiations by the end of 2024 in accordance with the mandate that we got from UNEA. And in trying to meet that deadline, there's a risk that we basically settle for any agreement. So we just kind of land on the points where there's agreement, which is, let's face it, more on the kind of downstream aspects and on kind of maintaining the status quo, where that's, there's convergence there. But the areas that are more tricky, those are the ones that are really going to land us a treaty that works, that's fit for purpose, the kind of treaty I think that Ed was alluding to. So I think the risk is just settling for anything. I think that's not good enough. We need to settle for something that's really effective. So deadlines are helpful. Cramming is also helpful. So I hope all of the delegates are cramming now. There's a lot of work to do between now and November to sort of figure out convergence on more topics than the ones that we currently are looking at, I think.
Thanks, Christina. I hate to think that you have the opinion of me that I would cram at the last minute, but no, I get the sentiment. Jeff, I want to come to you just to complete the quartet, to get any thoughts you might have there. Oh, Jeff, we can't hear you. You might have to go back to the headset. We'll give Jeff a couple of minutes to try that. Let's push on though. Christina, you mentioned there, that balance between time is of a premium, but we shouldn't just settle for anything. But when you think about where we are with the treaty and those priorities, Jeff, we got you. We're going to come back to you in a minute. Where we are with those priorities, what do you think we should defer then? What can be pushed later beyond that time frame that you alluded to before?
Yes, I think the interesting thing when we think about INC-5 is that we have this document, the compiled text, which I actually just checked a few minutes before this call because I had to remind myself. It's 77 pages. It's got something like 3,000 brackets in it. It's basically a completely unworkable document. Nobody's going to be using really this as the main basis for negotiations if we want to try and finish on time. So that's really no longer viable. So I think at the moment, the important things to think about are the kind of prioritization and sequencing. So what can we agree at INC-5 that provides us with a solid basis to kind of start and strengthen moving forward? So how can we craft text on things like, for example, plastic production? We know it's really important to agree on obligations across the full life cycle of plastics. So we need something on plastic production as a starting point, a minimum starting point, should I say, that can be developed going forward. So we're not going to, in my dreams, we would have a perfect text that deals with plastic production, but I'm a realist, pragmatist. So what I think we need to do is think about things like, okay, we need to agree on at least what is the transparency requirements for an obligation related to plastic production. What's a global target? What does it look like? What is a baseline? And have these kind of core elements that can be developed further forward, moving forward. And so I think in this kind of process of sequencing and prioritization, I'd be hoping to see things like, a clear path forward. So, obligations they might be more skeletal in nature, and they outline clearly what a legal obligation might be, an obligation on parties to have waste management aspects, for example, in their national plans, but the kind of full details of that could be developed for example, COP1, so intersessionally. So I think, most people who are realistic aren't expecting kind of fully developed text to happen in INC-5. We only have a few days to negotiate, but that kind of sequencing and the path, so to ensure that we're not deferring things and kind of kicking them into the long grass, we're being presented with a clear timeline and a kind of hierarchy. And I think there are elements, that are important, but I would say perhaps less important to be dealt with in that kind of prioritization. So things like, for example, EPR, I think we can kind of agree that EPR is important. We can reference EPR in the text that's agreed at INC-5, but the guidelines related to EPR could be developed at COP1. Whereas we know that there are topics around, for example, chemicals of concern in plastic, around finance, around production, which are going to need more negotiating time. So we'd like to see that time kind of protected in the negotiations. I could probably talk about that all day though.
Yeah,
so
I was just saying, you've thrown down quite a heavy gauntlet there, right? And there's a couple of bits that I'm sure we'll get into through the course of the conversation. But Jeff, I noticed you've got your headset back on, it's blinking at us. I want to come to you and give you a chance to chip in.
Thanks very much, James. Good afternoon, everyone. I love technology. There's a whole series of conversations. I mean, I don't want to repeat what's already been said, but I think the question of running out of time is key. This is absolutely essential, and we need to make sure that we actually do reach something that we can work with. Part of the conversation also is about ending plastic pollution. I mean, the conversation about circularity, the conversation about reuse is a key part of this, and that also leads into the whole idea of ensuring that we have value in the idea of a circular feedstock. That needs to work, and we have to look at that demand and that infrastructure. And I think, I realize there's an awful lot of work and background to be done here, but the negotiators need to ensure that the demand, the process, the systems thinking is what comes through. And part of that, mandatory recycle targets, looking at infrastructure, looking at sorting, and making that work with sustainable finance mechanisms. This is all part of it. And I think Christine's already mentioned EPR. Absolutely. This has got to be part of the conversation. The point I would make about EPR is that we should have materially neutral EPR systems. And the whole conversation that we're talking about is to develop an infrastructure for the raw material, and also not to forget an applications approach, because here I am, where I am, things in different ways, and that's key. We have to look at this in different ways.
You cut off just a little bit at the end there, Jeff, but I think we got the sentiment, and certainly one of those elements that you've been sort of talking through the course of this conversations is about that kind of application piece, the unique situation where some of these materials end up. I do want to keep us moving forward, and thank you all for your kind of opening comments, but I now want to move towards primary plastics. Christina, you touched on this a little bit just now. Do we think a target to reduce primary plastic production to sustainable levels at either the national or the kind of global level can provide a more level playing field for businesses? And if so, if it does, how can you see that being brought to life? Christina, I want you to open up the conversation for us, if you wouldn't mind, just quick 30 seconds. So if we think about reducing primary plastic production to a sustainable level, I know there's a conversation about what that actually means, but what does that look like for business, and how can you see that being brought to life?
Oh, in 30 seconds. All right, James. So this is going to be a challenge, but I'll give it a go. Yeah, I don't think it'll surprise anyone that, of course, EIA and many civil society stakeholders and rights holders feel like addressing plastic production is like the crown jewel of this plastics treaty. We're not going to end plastic pollution without dealing with plastic production. And I think from the kind of business perspective, the way that I see it is that, when we continue to flood the market with virgin plastic, we're undermining all of the interventions that we're envisaging downstream, the things that kind of, I guess, Ed and Unilever are relying on in order to kind of transition to a circular economy from a products perspective. If we constantly have cheap virgin plastic and we have the secondary market for raw materials undermined by these kind of market dynamics, it's incredibly challenging to have a level playing field for business and also to invest in reuse, to invest in waste management and so on. And I guess also many businesses are trying to establish themselves as being aligned with the 1.5 degrees target of the Paris Agreement. And we know that the majority of greenhouse gas emissions are at the upstream stage of the plastic life cycle. So if we don't deal with plastic production, we're not dealing with greenhouse gas emissions. So we're undermining businesses in their attempt to have sort of neutrality in their operations as best as possible. So I think there are many more arguments. Those were sort of three that I could immediately think of from the business perspective. And so I think in terms of bringing it to life,
I'm going to stop you there. I'm going to stop you there.
Go for it.
Because I think not because I don't want to hear what you've got to say, but you called out Ed there, and I want to come to you, Ed, if I can next, but also Chilla, just on that point about kind of the upstream piece. After we spoke to Ed, I'd love to get your perspective on that. So Ed, over to you. You were mentioned there by Christina.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, we firmly believe that production must be within scope of the treaty. Clearly, it's part of the full life cycle, of plastic, and we really need a commitment from member states to achieve sustainable levels of production and consumption. And as Christina said, it is possible to shift away from virgin-based materials, Unilever, for example, and we have around our plastic footprint is around 700,000 tons every year. And we've reduced our virgin plastic footprint by 18% since 2019. So a pretty big reduction in a short space of time. You know, a lot of technical challenges working with partners throughout the value chain to try and achieve that reduction. So these things are achievable. And I think in terms of the treaty, we need this commitment to achieve sustainable levels of production and consumption. And I think a really important first step is around transparency. So just as companies are voluntarily sharing our plastic footprint, you know, it's important for member states to be obliged to report on levels of plastic production so we can understand, you know, what the baseline is of where we are. So yeah, I think ensuring that production is within scope of the treaty and any agreement that is made at INC-5 is the most important thing.
Thank you, Ed. Chilla, coming to you then. Any other sort of, what would you like to add on top of that?
Well, maybe agreeing, you know, on Ed's comment on the level of sustainable consumption and production. I think we really agree, and WSDAO and the industry as a whole has made major commitments, public commitments to also, you know, move towards more sustainable, more circular production, also decarbonizing our production overall. For us, it's also about, you know, ending plastic pollution, but not really necessarily ending plastic production, but it's about changing the way towards more sustainable production. And this starts with product design, helping our customers, the value chain, meeting their targets for circularity as well as low carbon. And the other concern that we have is that if you simply cap production, costs will go up when you reduce supply. So this would translate to higher costs for many industries and will ultimately affect some of those low-income populations, especially in developing countries. So a cap per se doesn't seem to be in the landing zone for many of the countries that we've talked to. But I think if we can move more towards the sustainable production, where you have a lot of interventions and you create that demand through enabling policies, I think that's where parties and we could also meet with everybody. So I think there is a common goal there.
Thank you, Chilla. And you mentioned there about design, and that's a great segue to where I want to go next. But just before I do, Jeff, just wanted to come to you really briefly, if I may, because again, that idea of sustainable production, sustainable levels, it'd be great to get your perspective on that.
I mean, sustainable, we're back to words and definitions again, because the challenge of sustainable is part of it. You know, if we can bring energy into the mix, the trouble with one size fits all is, and I touched on this earlier, the whole application conversation, because it's the unintended consequences of the blunt instrument. That's part of the challenge. And actually, I'm an old-fashioned scientist. The short answer is we need a science-based approach, and we need to think about the applications to actually get those levers working within systems thinking. And I'm sorry to throw in another terminology. Somewhere in here, chemical recycling has to have a position. And where that fits in the mix is up for discussion. But we have to think about this as raw materials and useful materials, because actually the applications are key.
Jeff, thank you. There's a bit of distortion with your audio, but we got all of that. Thank you very much. I think that's the best we're going to settle for now. Ed, before chemical recycling, I want to come to that, especially with this audience. But Ed, I want to come to you on that idea of design, but maybe contextualize that with, where does phasing out or restricting plastic products come into this? Is it just better to create that, you know, phase that out of the design phase, or is it more than that?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, it's really important that the waste hierarchy guides the decision making and the kind of control measures that we have within the treaty. And when you look at, you know, as we said at the first question you had, how much work there is to do in the first to try and agree by INC-5, finding these areas where we know there's practical, achievable solutions that businesses already worked on is a really smart place to consider when we need to start prioritizing, to Christina's point. And I think, whilst plastic is a useful material in many ways, clearly some of the ways that we use the material or the combinations of materials are problematic and can be avoided. And for many of these, industries already voluntarily phased away or phased out the particular materials or material combinations that we know are problematic and can be avoided. And having clarity as a business on what materials, won't be used in the future can actually help innovation to foster and prosper. So we really think governments need to agree on some global definitions and criteria and initial lists to restrict or phase out problematic and avoidable plastic products. And as part of that, consider the general approaches to product design. In many instances, we can continue to use plastic, but remove the unrecyclable problematic elements so the material can be mechanically recycled if there is collection and processing in place, which again, through things like EPR, you can build sustainable funding for those systems. But I think within all of this, it's really important to follow that waste hierarchy, and that with the kind of short amount of time left, consider what are the most impactful decisions that we can make at INC-5, which for us clearly should involve phasing out and restricting certain plastic products and certain polymers, and having then dedicated programs of work to kind of flesh out the details of those restrictions after INC-5.
Thank you, Ed. I've got to push us on, as you'd expect, and I want to come back to that comment that Jeff made around chemical recycling, and get your perspectives, if I may, please, on how that fits into the definitions, or does it, right? How should we articulate it in the context of the treaty? Does it need to be defined within international legally binding instrument? Chilla, could you start us off?
Yes, thank you. So I think Jeff already alluded to it. We want the agreement to be technology agnostic, right? You would want to foster innovation, all sorts of, sorting, recycling technologies. So there is definitely, a place for chemicals recycling as complementary to mechanical recycling. So we fully agree, mechanical recycling should be the first priority. You need the design that's been mentioned to make products recyclable. But then there are certain hard to recycle plastics that go into specific high quality and very sensitive applications like food contact materials or medical supplies, where chemical recycling can be the right technology. So you wouldn't want to prevent it. Now, does it need a specific mention in the agreement? Not really sure if you go for technology neutral. But there is anyway, it could defer to definitions under the Basel Convention, where under the Basel Technical Guidelines, there are provisions on the environmentally sound management of plastic wastes, including recycling. And that's an ongoing process. Certain things have been defined, other things not yet. But I would see, rather than, duplicating anything that's been defined elsewhere, just defer to Basel for that.
Thank you, Jeff. You kicked us off with chemical recycling. Just want to come back and see if you've got any comments to add into that as well.
I think there's also been mention made of the waste hierarchy, and there's a whole series of cultural conversations in there as well about how we use the materials, and that is being materially agnostic. I know we're here talking about plastic, but that's part of the conversation. And again, and I'm sorry to repeat myself, it's the whole idea of mandatory targets, for recycling, for having an infrastructure, and ensuring that the EPR schemes work so we can have sustainable financing. I mean, we've got to drive this stuff. And I hate to be very blunt, if we're all agreed, what's the problem? I mean, somewhere along the line, we have to be pragmatic here and make this work, because the material is useful. There's no question about that. The applications are useful. But we have to be careful because we haven't used it properly.
Jeff, thank you very much. We're getting close to time, unfortunately, and I know we did want to kind of talk a little bit about chemicals of concern and problematic plastics and also means of implementation, but we will get to those conversations in the board in the breakout sessions. But I want to finish, if I may, with something that's maybe a little bit more subjective, and all four of you have been in this process for a while. We are heading towards INC-5. When we think about that, what are you hopeful for, given all of the bits we chat about, because of the limitations in time and, you know, where we need to focus, what needs to push beyond the treaty? What are you hopeful for at INC-5 in South Korea in those discussions, and what would good look like? I know that sounds like a very big question to kind of sum up in sort of 10 to 15 seconds each, but Ed, starting with you, we think about INC-5 coming up. What are you hopeful for? What would good look like for you, for Unilever, off the back of those discussions?
Yeah, sure. So many of us have followed this process, you know, for many years, and I think, you know, what we're hopeful for is that this political will and this kind of driving towards a compromise that still has the level of ambition that we need is really what the next 8-9 weeks, someone could correct me on that, 8-9 weeks are about, up until INC-5. And, you know, I think there is a sensible approach being taken to perhaps look at a new approach on the text. And, you know, we really need to make sure that the political will is there to actually agree a treaty that's fit for purpose. I think it's okay to prioritize, and some have elements which will be agreed afterwards, but having this structure of the treaty, including spaces where there are clearly binding rules and mandatory obligations on countries to do certain things, is exactly what a treaty that's fit for purpose looks like in our view.
Thank you, Ed. Chilla, what does good look like for you?
Right. I think going back to my earlier comments, we want an agreement that is inclusive of all countries, is implementable. That means, you know, it would also need to have the adequate financing and capacity building mechanism, and that really drives plastic circularity, you know, moving us away from the linear to a more circular economy.
Chilla, thank you very much. Jeff, same to you. What does good look like?
Good looks like a pragmatic policy framework that people can actually make work within their situation, both locally and nationally. And part of this somewhere has got to be the whole question of waste management infrastructure. It really has, and that's got to be de-risked, it's got to be invested in, and we've got to drive that forward within the conversations around the policy framework.
Thank you, Jeff. And Christina, come on, take us home.
Okay. Yeah, I'll try. Well, I think, you know, we have this once in a generation opportunity to actually create something meaningful here. And so I feel like, for me, good looks like an ambitious instrument that has interventions that are legally binding across the full life cycle of plastics, and a clear roadmap for how we're going to strengthen that instrument over time. And it's really got to set us up for creating kind of systems for the future, rather than just kind of maintaining the status quo and kind of creating a new patchwork of stuff. So I think it's things, you know, there's the obligations across the life cycle of plastics, but there's also things like, you know, how can we implement the polluter pays principle when we're designing the financial mechanism? How can we create a dedicated fund that is responsive to the very unique challenges of addressing plastic pollution, and ensuring that it's stable, predictable, and accessible for developing countries so that they can really implement this agreement? So in terms of implementability, I think that's something that actually maybe we all agree on, but the ways in which we do that and the things that they're implementing might actually be different things, but it's a starting point. So I think that's what good looks like for me.
So what I heard there from you folks was, it's got to be ambitious, it's got to be inclusive and implementable, it's got to be pragmatic, it's got to be legally binding, it's got to be systemic. Looks like, you know, we've got to get busy for the last number of weeks. Ed, Scilla, Jeff, Christina, thank you very much for kind of giving us that opening gambit as we go into the board. Appreciate your comments and your perspectives there, and I'm sure the folks at home do as well. Thank you very much. I'm now going to hand over to Marta, who's going to take us through the review of the sectoral meetings, before we get into those breakout rooms to get into the conversation. Marta, over to you.
Hi, James. Thank you so much. So before we get started with the breakouts, we want to have just a quick moment to go over some of the topics we've discussed during the sectoral meetings and give you an overview of some of the sticky notes that came forward. So the content you really see that I'm putting forward is very much coming from all of you. If we can go to the next slides, please. So during our sectoral meetings, we've really covered 6 kind of key priority topics, considering where we currently stand. So the essential elements of the treaty, what elements can be agreed on after treaty ratification, the means of implementations, including finance, and core topics such as primarily plastic production, chemical and problematic plastics, as well as product design. And so now I'm going to dive into each individual sectoral meetings and highlight some of the priorities. Naturally, this is not representative of the sectoral or group perspective, but just kind of highlighting some of the ideas that came forward. And a lot of them you've already probably heard during the panel discussion earlier. So with the ENGO and academia group, we've discussed all the 6 topics, but I'm just highlighting a few right now. And as we go in the boards, you will be seeing the rest of the content shortly. So in terms of the essential elements, the group has brought forward the need for a global target to cut plastic production. This has been obviously a consistent topic, but they've also brought forward the need for the just transition health equity provisions for acknowledging the specific needs that there might be across, for example, SEDS, the disproportionate impacts of the informal sector workers as well. In terms of the elements to be agreed on after treaty ratification, the group has brought forward, for example, national action plans that are complementary to hopefully ambitious global rules, as well as the details around specific systemic changes, for example, reuse and the specific sectoral guidance that would be required for making those feasible, as well as focus on sector-specific programs of work. Primary plastic production, of course, has been at the core of our discussions during the sectoral meetings. So here the group has been bringing forward the need for globally agreed national targets that can still reflect different contexts, for example, of developing countries and the need for longer transition, etc. But the need for the globally agreed national targets has been voiced multiple times. And again, a transparency framework and reporting on production, trade, and consumption of primary plastics should and must be included in the scope. This also came up multiple times. And now we can move to the next. So the next meeting we've had was a group of upstream stakeholders came together to discuss the similar topics, and here highlighting a few differences that we always see. So naturally here, there has been a very strong call for sustainable production rather than limiting production, and we can have all a chat about how that should look like, if so, in the upcoming breakout, and the definitions of terminologies. So what is sustainable production? How do we define it if that's the pathway forward? We've also had questions included about chemical recycling, just in the context of whether or not it falls in the definition of primary plastic production. And the groups across really have all agreed mostly that it does not really belong within the primary plastic production discussion. Where does it belong? I mean, we can talk about that a little bit more shortly. In terms of the chemicals and problematic plastics, there have been critical calls for national level chemical regulations, as well as alignments with existing frameworks, making sure that restrictions fit at national level. A REACH has been brought forward as an existing and living document that should be referenced to and with. And again, the big thought was really about how you regulate. Is it risk-based? Is it science-based? Rather, whether there is an existing system in place. In terms of means of implementation, we really focus on finance here. There have been talks about how do we de-risk the investment for private sector. And again, linking the need for EPR with building an efficient business model for circular economy that can really help us with this transition has been also a big part of the talks. And as well as, kind of leaning towards the UK government specifically, asking for maybe an approach to circularity that is really going across the departments. So looking at environment, business, net zero as aspects that maybe should be considered jointly, not separately. That's also something that came forward in the discussions. And then next slide, please. So following upstream, we met with the midstream stakeholders as well. Here, we've seen some alignment around the essential elements and the really need for the global target to cut plastic production, as well as the specific list of problematic elimination items that should be included, sectoral approach, focusing really on the most pressing and polluting plastics, consumer household packaging, again, it was coming forward strongly, and EPR. In terms of the primary plastic production, obviously a complex conversation again, but here what we saw as well were contributions around the combination of targets, caps, EPR, plastic tax to ultimately stop production as maybe a way to go about the solution to this, and a need to establish a baseline at a global and national level. And again, it will be difficult to define what the sustainable levels of production are according to the midstream stakeholders, so bringing that forward for a discussion around definition, technologies, transparency framework, and so on, that we're hoping to have with you shortly. In terms of product design, again, we really focused on what is the right material for the right purpose, for the right lifespan, and a suitable end-of-life option. How can we really circularly design this transformation moving forward? And really an awareness of what is possible now and what can be brought forward in the future, and how do we get from A to B should be a critical part of the discussion and the development of the text moving forward. And next slide, please. And last but not least, we did meet with the downstream stakeholders as well. And again, here, similarly, very similar ideas were coming forward around sustainable production rather than limiting production itself, definition and the terminology that's required to put this forward, alignment with existing frameworks, again, REACH have come forward here as well. And then in terms of chemicals and problematic plastic, focusing on specific substances and chemicals, for example, PFAs, and need to consider how we're handling this specific issue. Alongside with means of implementation, we're here, the group has brought forward that public funds are strained and private investments is stifled by ROI. How do we get around that? And again, the need for a business model to work on circular economy specifically, and making really a business out of circularity, and making sure that is de-risked and strategically organized for all the stakeholders included, has been a big part of the discussion. So on that note, now I'm going to hand it over to James, and we're going to be actually diving into those boards, and you'll be having an opportunity to look in deeply into those sticky notes and really kind of drive the conversation forward from here collectively. So I'm just going to hand it over to you, James.
Thank you, Marta. So as Marta alluded to there, as our panel discussion alluded to as well, whether you were in the initial conversations or not, we've given you a rundown of the kind of themes, the topics that came up with the questions that we asked. So now we're going to throw over to you to get back into that, and more importantly, to interrogate some of those elements that we've heard today that maybe you don't align with, and understand some of that a bit better. So we're going to break you into two rooms. We've got 30 minutes for this. This is where it moves from transmission to participation. In breakout room A with myself and my colleague Megan, we're going to be looking at cross-cutting issues, primary plastic production, and chemicals and problematic plastics. And in breakout room B with Marta and with Rachel, you're going to be looking at product design, primary plastic production, and means of implementation. So you'll see comments in there that you will have already covered before, but actually this is about getting into those conversations you weren't maybe part of because you were in different sectoral conversations, or you couldn't make those and you've only been able to make the plenary. So we're going to head into our rooms now. A bit of admin. We have assigned you into one or the other. We've tried to give a split between the different sectoral participants so that there's an equal weighting of voices in each room. Please, we ask that whichever room you're assigned to, you stay in that room. That just gives us an opportunity to capture as much as we can in the short period of time that we have. The sessions in the rooms will be recorded as well, so we can get as much of that information down as possible. If for whatever reason, when we go into our separate rooms, you're still in the main area, please don't panic. We will then very quickly assign you into one of either room A or room B. Once you get into the room, cameras on, sit back, relax, put yourself on mute to start with, please, if you wouldn't mind. We'll share the screen with the mural board. The link will also go into the chat as well if you want to access it independently, but we'll share the board with you once we're in the room. And then that way we can get stuck into those conversations, and either myself or Marta in the other room will be taking you through those questions over the next 30 minutes. So let's get into it. This is your moment to get stuck in, to participate, and to put your comments across for everything you've heard today and everything you see on the boards. And I will see my cohort shortly in room A, and Marta will see the other cohort shortly in room B.
Hi, everyone. I'll be starting the rooms in just a moment, so you should be brought there. See you all
Thank you,
soon.
Rachel. And you should have a little pop-up on your screen now.
Hi, Megan. I was assigning breakout room like A, and suddenly I was brought back to the main room.
Let's see. Hold
I wonder if
on.
I touched what I shouldn't have, which can very possibly be, but
Right, give me a moment. Because I'm not the one. I don't know if I'll have access to add you. Give me a moment. You said that you were in A, right?
yes.
Okay.
But happy to go to B if they need some extra people. Like it's just that I was suddenly kicked out.
Yeah, I don't know why that was. Hold on. For some reason, I don't have access to the breakout rooms. Hold on. Okay. It's gonna have to be B if that's okay.
Sounds good.
All right. We will see you in there.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, as we start to filter back in, give folks just a chance to jump back into the main room. And what we're going to do now, just over the next couple of minutes, and it literally is only a couple of minutes, we will just want to drag out some of the key points of our separate conversations in the different rooms. Megan, Rachel, do we think folks are back in?
I think they're still coming back. So
Yeah,
give everybody just 1 second.
Yeah, I think the breakout room should be over in about 15 seconds.
Okay. Well, we'll give those folks a chance to get back. We wouldn't want them to miss the insights. But thank you, folks. Thank you for those contributions. Marta, I don't know about you, it was a little bit quiet in our room. I guess they were busy reading the board. But if we've got folks back in now, looks like we've got the vast majority. There's still a few drifting back in. Marta, in our room, I guess looking at the board, we had a massive picture of my face on the screen now. We had quite a few comments in the early questions and towards the end. It was on the sort of primary plastic production. Folks seemed to just agree with what was already there and just endorsing. But there were a couple of points that came out and I wanted to pull out specifically. And Aaron, I'd love to come to you if I can, if you're back in the room. Aaron from Coca-Cola. You put a comment down simply about LCA criteria. This was under the question of what do you consider to be essential elements to be agreed on in the treaty. Would you mind just expanding your thoughts just in the main room?
James, I think Aaron had to drop.
Perfect. Right. Well, Josh, I'm going to come straight to you then, because you followed a similar thing around EPR. Could you just pull that forward for us if you wouldn't mind?
Yeah, for sure. We and I'll let John chip in as well if he's got anything to add, but we see the treaty as a real opportunity for EPRs in the sense that at the moment there's this very fragmented landscape, lots of different requirements in lots of different jurisdictions. Anything the treaty can do to just provide a bit more harmonization around that's something that we would be very keen to see. I think I'm looking at things like areas like data collection requirements, anything we can do around infrastructure improvements, all of that kind of stuff. We would definitely be well behind that.
Thank you, Josh. John, anything you wanted to add on to that? No, shaking your head. And so the second person I wanted to call out as well was Carla. If Carla's still in the room, she raised a point around how do you create a level playing field when we think about the different challenges faced with different sized countries in the kind of spectrum of developing and non-developing, specifically around what is the metric we use when we think about plastic production and harmonizing that. Carla, if you wouldn't mind just sharing your thoughts.
Yeah, of course. So just before I get into that, just wanted to agree with what Josh was saying about the EPR and the kind of harmonization, the need for harmonized standards. With regards to kind of reporting, I think that we see that I think that the conversation was around achieving global targets and around primary plastic production and consumption specifically. That consideration could be given potentially to thinking about some splits. So largely producer states, largely kind of producer-consumer states, and then those states that are mainly just consumers that don't produce any plastic at all and that are mainly kind of importers of plastic. So differentiating between these kind of categories and therefore their kind of obligations for reporting as well could be one way to level the playing field around that and make sure that the states that the handful of states that have the majority of production would be reporting the required needs, and then from there kind of starting on a start and strengthen approach so that everyone ends up kind of at the same level. But in this way, you would be kind of disadvantaging those countries that don't have much production at all.
Thank you, Carla. Marta, lots more kind of detail in the board, which obviously we'll capture, but those were the kind of key highlights I wanted to pull out from there. So over to you and breakout room B.
Of course. Well, we had quite a, I think, dynamic discussion. I think most will agree. And we've covered a lot. I mean, product design has been a big part of the discussion today. So we dove into, the design criteria, and there has been an ongoing discussion around toxicity and what does it mean outside of recyclability, reusability. and so on. How do we address toxicity in design criteria? And I do want to call in one of our participants, Professor Sally Becken. Can you comment on just a lot on the toxicity debate quickly?
Yeah, I can. My background was formulating pharmaceutically clean polymers, so I know that you can formulate polymer products with low levels of additives and still be functional and practical. But my point was around, we need to make sure that the additives we use are kind of within the workflow, polymer workflow or polymer flows. Don't cross the streams, to take a Ghostbusters quote, because the non-intentionally added substances across different sectors that are used, perhaps for fire retardants, someone else mentioned fire retardants, we're going to give ourselves a lot easier job. We're going to reduce the amount of toxicity to humans if we keep as many additives low values as possible, and make sure that we keep those materials in the same streams. The chemistry will be a lot easier to sort out, basically.
Thank you so much, Sally. And just a follow-up question to you, and before I move to our other colleagues here, in terms of the discussion around the definition of primary plastic production specifically, we talked about how to include chemical recycling at all in that discussion, and you brought up some points about that maybe that terminology should not exist in the text, and how it should be otherwise addressed overall. I'm sorry, but
yeah, instead of using chemical recycling, I use the word depolymerization. That was something I did in my PhD. So it's about deconstructing the polymers into the building blocks that will allow us greater circularity. It was mentioned by someone else in the preliminary before we went into workshops about medical polymers and food contact needing to be, ultra clean and not contain anything harmful at all. So I think deconstruction of polymers is something that should be in the treaty. It definitely is not primary carbon and fossil-based carbon. And the other point I made was around the fact that bio-based polymers are going to be treated as primary polymers. I think they're a subset. This is just my own opinion, because the source of the carbon is important. If it's fossil-based, we should be definitely reducing that as much as we can. But bio-based is new carbon that was in the atmosphere a few years ago, or maybe last year, and for it to potentially return to the environment, it should not be as a pollutant. It should be managed. Isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's not adding to the overall carbon in the atmosphere. So I think there's a subtlety there that's not captured in the wording at the moment.
Thank you so much, Sally. And I know we have to close, but I do want to call in just one final 1-minute comment from Jess Blake from Berry Global. So we talked about a lot of things, wide range of topics, but also means of implementation and finance. If you can give us just like a 30 seconds of, some of your point of view on means of implementation and finance for this treaty.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We're just about to close, and I was just echoing the view that we need to open up some finance fairly quickly and have a fund to be able to really start getting into the levelling up of some of the countries that are having the worst problems in relation to this. But I think the key point that I just wanted to add on to the end of it is about enforcement, because in relation to a lot of the things we've got, even in their relatively short history in relation to some of the more developed countries, UK, Europe and sort of stuff, there's just fraud and criminality and people trying to subvert the system in everything we do. So I think it's very important that we consider that when we put things in place, we need to have adequate enforcement of the things that we want to happen. So rather than just trusting everybody to do the right thing. So that's probably the only last point for me, Marta. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jess. And with that in mind, we'll hand it over back to James George and James Smith. Closing remarks.
Yeah, Martin, thank you. And thanks, folks. And yeah, it's my great pleasure very shortly to introduce James Smith, Deputy Director of International Marine at DEFRA, returning for another closing comments, James. Good to see you. But thank you, everyone, for your time this afternoon. We know we've covered a lot of ground. One last request from myself, the survey. You've already received it. If you haven't filled it out, please do so, and please fill it out with full commitment, because we need that information in order to put the best picture forward for what the UK plastics value chain needs the UK government to take forward to those negotiations in November. And with that, thank you to the panel. Thank you for all of you. Over to you, Mr. James Smith, Deputy Director for International Marine at DEFRA. James.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, James. And firstly, a huge thanks to OPLN and to all of you for joining today, for your contributions, not only today, but for all the sectoral discussions that I know have gone into preparing for this session as well that were held earlier this month. I just want to pause on the challenge just for a second. So, yeah, around 11 million metric tons of plastic entering the ocean annually. And as the Minister said, we're currently on course for this to triple between 2016 and 2040. And that is, I mean, quite simply, we just can't let that scenario play out. Continue to damage global ecosystems, impact animal and human health, and the economy. We're on the brink of that crucial 5th round of negotiations to really push to reach agreement on that treaty, beyond that driving towards implementation. So such an important time for us to be convening again. And as I've said before, I can't underestimate or underline enough just how vital it is hearing all of the breadth of the views on these sectoral discussions in the plenary today to get a better understanding of the priorities as we move into South Korea, but also continuing to press those messages collectively in the run-up to and at INC-5 will be absolutely critical. So, you know, it's fantastic to hear your views on what you see as the crucial elements of the treaty, whether that be the importance of the waste hierarchy, the right materials at the right products in the right context in the right sectors, as we've heard through some of the breakout discussions as well, harmonization, the need to create that plastics landscape that fosters a level playing field of innovation and technology, the importance of not leaving anybody behind, of the finance mobilization of the right instrument to put in place, and of course the recognition that there's hugely important and probably significant work to do once the treaty text has been adopted as well. And there's been loads more that myself and other members of the negotiations team have been listening intently on during these sessions. All of this input, all of the survey, that really is invaluable to shape our UK approach and position going into INC-5, and to really make the most of this unique opportunity to agree that ambitious and internationally binding instrument to address plastic pollution. So I'll end there, given the time. Just a massive thank you again for your input, for your engagement. I really look forward to continuing the discussions with you and with international partners as we move closer towards that agreement in South Korea. So thank you again and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.